Okay, so think about those stories, the ones that stick with you, the stories that kind of pop up in different cultures, different times. The Red Sea crossing, that's got to be one of them, right? That incredible escape from Egypt. It makes you wonder what actually happened. Was it a miracle or a trick of nature, or was it, I don't know, something else?
Yeah, it's a story that really grabs you, and I think for good reason. I mean, you're talking about freedom, faith, power of the totally unexpected. It touches on so many big things that it's no wonder it keeps being discussed and reinterpreted in so many fields even today.
Exactly. And that's exactly what we're going to try to unpack in this deep dive. You're someone who likes to really get a good understanding of things, without getting bogged down in the details. And we thought, okay, let's gather a really diverse bunch of sources to dig into the evidence, or maybe even like the different kinds of evidence surrounding the Exodus and the Red Sea crossing.
We've definitely cast a wide net here. We're looking at everything from a really quick kind of overview on TikTok, referencing the Bible. And then we've got something a little more comprehensive like Wikipedia. And then we've got some really detailed discussions from an archaeology magazine and of course the original text from Exodus itself. Oh, and we've even got some insights from like explorers and scientists on YouTube and some articles from an archaeology research ministry. It's a real mix of perspectives.
It's a tapestry, that's the perfect word for it. And our mission, what we really want to do here is to understand all of these different viewpoints. So we want to look at the ideas about where the heck this crossing took place, what kind of evidence is out there, and ultimately what we can figure out from all of this without getting into all the arguments, right? The political stuff, the religious stuff, all the hot button stuff in the sources. We're not here to take sides, right? We just want to explore and try to understand. So with a story this old, this big, where do we even start? To me, it feels kind of natural to start with the account that kicked it all off for so many people, the Bible.
Absolutely. So if you open up your Bible, Exodus chapter 14, verses 21 through 29, in the easy to read version, you get this really dramatic story, right? The story goes Moses raises his hand, and this strong east wind blows all night long. And get this, the sea splits, creating dry land right down the middle with these walls of water on each side. So the Israelites, they start walking across this dry land.
Such a visual scene, right?
Absolutely. And then, oh, here comes the entire Egyptian army, chariots, horses, soldiers, the whole shebang in hot pursuit.
And we all know, I think, that it doesn't end so well for the Egyptians.
You got it. So the story goes on describing how the Egyptian chariots, their wheels get stuck, they start panicking, and then Moses raises the hand again and the water comes crashing back, completely covering the entire Egyptian army that had followed them. It's pretty emphatic, not a single one of them survived.
Wow. So talk about a decisive end to the chase. That's amazing. Now, it's interesting how this story, it pops up at other faiths too. And Wikipedia has this really fascinating entry on the crossing of the Red Sea that mentions the Islamic perspective,
Yeah.
which has a really interesting twist.
Yeah, and in the Islamic tradition, the focus is really on Pharaoh in his final moments. So as he's about to drown, he suddenly declares his belief in the God of Israel and submits. But the story emphasizes that this change of heart, it comes way too late, given all the bad stuff he did. And this is the interesting part. God preserves Pharaoh's body as a sign, like a warning, for everyone who comes after him.
So it's like this permanent reminder of the consequences, right? Pretty powerful stuff. Okay, so we've got the basic biblical narrative, and we've got this fascinating Islamic perspective. But then you start to wonder, where geographically did all this happen? And that's where things get really interesting and a lot more debated, right?
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of our sources highlight this main disagreement. Are we talking about a crossing up north, like near the Bitter Lakes or the Suez Canal, or are we talking about a crossing way down south at the Gulf of Aqaba? And the Armstrong Institute article and the Patterns of Evidence documentary, they really lay out this north-south debate really clearly.
Okay, so for someone who might not be familiar with the Bitter Lakes theory, what's the basic idea behind it?
Well, the Bitter Lakes theory, as explained in their Armstrong Institute article, tries to explain what happened in the Exodus using natural explanations. So instead of these massive walls of water miraculously held back, they're suggesting maybe it was a more gradual thing. Maybe a strong wind pushed back the shallow water in a lake or a marshy area, and that created a temporary land bridge that the Israelites could walk across. So it's basically trying to understand it all as a natural phenomenon, not a straight-up miracle.
That's a big difference in how you interpret the whole event, right? Now, on the other side, you have the Gulf of Aqaba theory, which seems to be getting a lot of attention. What's the main argument for this southern location?
The focus here, you'll see this in the Discovered Media YouTube video and the Evidence for Faith discussion, is on Nuweiba Beach on the Gulf of Aqaba. People who support this theory point to what they think is a gently sloping underwater land bridge that stretches from Nuweiba toward the other side, where Saudi Arabia is now.
Yeah.
Their idea is that during a super low tide, maybe helped along by some wind, this underwater slope would have been exposed, and that would have created a path that lots of people could walk across.
So Nuweibat becomes this key location if you believe in the Southern Crossing theory. But the Armstrong Institute article also mentions the Gulf of Suez as another possibility. What's the thinking there?
It's an interesting one. The article points out that the northern part of the Gulf of Suez, it has the smooth, shallow seabed. And they suggest that this lines up with some descriptions we have, like in Josephus, where he talks about the seabed as a road, and in Psalm 106.9, where it mentions a wilderness. The idea is that this shallow area might have been an easier route for a big group to cross, maybe even with chariots, if the conditions were right.
And then there's that whole thing about the Sea of Reeds, or Yam Suf in Hebrew, right? The New Evidence from Egypt article talks about that. How does that linguistic point play into the location debate?
Oh, this is a big one. So the Hebrew Yam Suf, it gets translated as Red Sea a lot, but it can also mean Sea of Reeds. And the New Evidence from Egypt article really emphasizes that Yam Suf might actually be talking about this area with marshy lakes and reeds that's close to the Suez Isthmus. And guess what? Reeds still grow there today. So this idea suggests that maybe the crossing wasn't this dramatic deep sea event. Maybe it was something smaller, more local in a marshy area. So understanding this Hebrew term is crucial because it opens up all these other possibilities.
That really changes the picture, doesn't it? It shows how even the name of the sea itself is up for interpretation and how that can really affect where we think this whole thing happened. Now, whenever you talk about the Gulf of Aqaba theory, you hear the name Ron Wyatt. What's his connection to this whole thing?
Yeah, Ron Wyatt, he was this amateur archaeologist who made some pretty wild claims. The patterns of evidence and discovered media videos talk about him. Basically, he said he found actual evidence of the Exodus on the seafloor near Nuweiba Beach in the Gulf of Aqaba. And what he thought he found were pieces of chariots from Pharaoh's army.
So, like actual chariot parts down there. Wow. And what do real archaeologists think about all this?
Well, the Armstrong Institute article points out that a lot of professional archaeologists are really skeptical about Wyatt's findings. He wasn't trained as an archaeologist, and he made other unusual claims about finding biblical artifacts like Noah's Ark and the Ark of the Covenant. So many archaeologists don't really trust his methods or his conclusions.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's important to know the context of his work. But the Evidence for Faith video brings up these coral formations at Nuweiba. What do they say about that?
Their argument is kind of interesting. They know that wooden chariot parts wouldn't last for 3,400 years underwater, especially in a tropical place. So they're suggesting that coral might have grown on these decaying parts over time, basically covering them up. And the idea is that the coral would have taken the shape of the original chariot parts, like the wheels or axles, even though the wood itself is long gone. So you wouldn't find actual chariot wheels, but you might find coral that looks like them.
So, like, the coral made a mold of the chariot parts. That's really creative. And the Evidence for Faith video also talks about how deep the water is at Aqaba. Why is that important for their theory?
They're saying that while the Gulf of Aqaba is really deep in some spots, the area where the supposed underwater land bridge is at Nuweiba, it might have been shallow enough to open up temporarily for the crossing, but it was still deep enough that a whole army could drown when the water came back. They compare it to the Bitter Lakes, which are much shallower, and say that it wouldn't make sense for so many people to drown in such a shallow area.
That makes sense. And the Armstrong Institute article mentioned how the land around the Gulf of Aqaba might fit the description of the Israelites being trapped, right? Like they were hemmed in.
Yeah, exactly. The article talks about how the Gulf of Aqaba has these really steep mountains that come right down to the coast, and they say that this matches the description in Exodus 14.3, where it says the Israelites were entangled in the land, the wilderness had shut them in. People who support the Aqaba crossing say this geography makes sense. It's like they were stuck with the sea in front of them and mountains all around, and Nuweiba Beach was their only way out.
Okay, so those are some of the main arguments for Aqaba. But, like with all the other theories, there are some big challenges and counter-arguments, right?
Oh yeah, the Creation.com article, it brings up a basic problem. How can you find archaeological evidence after 3,400 years underwater, especially in a tropical sea? They point out that wood rots super fast because of things like shipworms and metals like bronze. They break down in salt water because of this thing called bronze plague. So finding chariot parts in good condition, it's really, really unlikely, no matter where you're looking.
It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack.
Mm-hmm.
But the haystack is also underwater and falling apart.
Mm-hmm.
And the Creation.com article also warns about those coral formations, right? Like, maybe they're not what they seem.
Right. They say you have to be careful not to get tricked by how coral grows naturally. Lots of types of coral grow in all kinds of shapes, including flat, plate-like shapes and round discs. They can even grow on stalks that look like stems. And the article says that these natural formations could easily be mistaken for chariot wheels, especially if you're looking for that kind of evidence. There's actually a Patterns of Evidence YouTube video that shows this really well. They have these coral experts who show examples of coral that look surprisingly like wheels, but it's totally natural.
So just because you see a round piece of coral doesn't mean it's an ancient chariot wheel. It could just be nature being creative.
Yeah.
And the Armstrong Institute also talked about Ron Wyatt's credibility in general.
Yeah, they point out that Wyatt made some other pretty controversial claims that haven't been proven. And this makes people doubt his findings about the Red Sea crossing, too. It's like, if some of your stories are questionable, people are going to be suspicious of all your stories, even the ones that might be true.
That's understandable. And when you look at how deep the Gulf of Aqaba is, it seems like it would be really tough for that land bridge idea to work.
Right, exactly. The Armstrong Institute really emphasizes how ridiculously deep the Gulf of Aqaba is in most parts. Even in that spot near Nuweiba Beach where they think the underwater land bridge is, the middle of it is still like 850 meters deep, which is crazy. That's like 2,800 feet. They even compare it to the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world, just to show you how enormous a wall of water that would be. So the idea that people could walk across that and that fragile stuff like chariot parts could survive, it seems pretty unlikely.
I mean, that Burj Khalifa comparison really puts it in perspective. That's a huge amount of water. And there's this comment in the Archaeology magazine by S. Campbell that brings up a really good point about the lack of evidence. Like,
Yeah.
if this was such a big event, where's all the stuff?
Yeah, S. Campbell makes a great point. If there was this massive military disaster, you'd think we'd find more evidence all over the place. And they even suggest that if we do find a random ancient wheel or something, it might actually be from a shipwreck that happened sometime over the centuries, not from Pharaoh's army. It's really hard to connect these isolated finds to the specific event described in Exodus.
That's a good reminder that we have to be careful about jumping to conclusions. So let's zoom out a little bit and think about the bigger picture, the biblical and historical context. The term Yam Suf itself seems to be a key piece of the puzzle, as both the Armstrong Institute and Evidence for Faith discuss.
Right. How you interpret Yam Suf is really important for figuring out the location. We usually translate it as Red Sea, but remember it can also mean Sea of Reeds, and that points to a totally different environment. The Armstrong Institute mentions this ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible called the Septuagint. It's over 2,000 years old, and it uses different Greek words for the Gulf of Aqaba and the sea that was crossed in the Exodus. This suggests that even way back then, scholars knew there was a difference between them. And the Evidence for Faith video points out that in other places in the Hebrew Bible, like in Numbers and 1 Kings, Yam Suf seems to refer to the Gulf of Aqaba. So maybe the term had a more general meaning or even changed meaning over time. Like in Numbers, it talks about traveling by way of the Red Sea to get around Edom, which definitely sounds like the Gulf of Aqaba.
So Yam Suf isn't so straightforward, right? Its meaning seems to depend on the context. Now, shifting gears a bit, there's this interview with Carol Myers in the Novia documentary where she brings up this cool concept called memo history.
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea. She's basically saying that the Exodus story might not be meant to be a super accurate historical record in the way we think about history today. Instead, it's more like this powerful form of collective cultural memory, like a shared story that helps people remember who they are and what they believe. And this type of story, it's not so much about getting all the facts straight. It's more about preserving values and beliefs and passing them down through generations.
So it's more about the meaning and the impact of the story than about having a perfectly accurate timeline. And both Wikipedia and the Novia documentary talk about how scholars still debate how historically accurate the Exodus story is.
Definitely. There are lots of different opinions. Some scholars think there's probably some truth to the story. Maybe a smaller group left Egypt, and their experience got turned into this epic story in the Bible. Others think the Exodus is mostly a symbolic story, like a myth that helped create the identity of ancient Israel. And Wikipedia even mentions that parts of the Bible suggest that the Exodus story might have been used as a kind of state ideology, especially for the northern kingdom of Israel.
Okay, so it might have been a mix of history, myth, and political strategy all rolled into one. And the Armstrong Institute article talks about this place called Avaris in the Nile Delta as a possible starting point for the Israelites. How does knowing where they might have started affect the theories about the crossing location?
Well, if they started in Orivris, which is in the eastern part of the Nile Delta, that helps us narrow down the routes they could have taken. A crossing further north, like through the Sea of Reeds near the Suez Isthmus, makes more sense geographically because it's closer to their starting point. It would have been a really long trip to go all the way south to the Gulf of Aqaba, especially within the time frame the Bible describes.
Speaking of time frame, the Armstrong Institute also mentions that it took about 2 months to get to Sinai, according to the Bible.
Yeah.
Does that affect which crossing locations seem more believable?
Yeah, it does. If they really traveled for 2 months to reach Sinai, going all the way to the Gulf of Aqaba and then crossing it would have been incredibly tough for a big group with women, children, and animals. It just seems like too much distance to cover in that amount of time. So a crossing location that's closer to where they started in Egypt seems more likely.
So the timeline fits better with the northern crossing point. Now, beyond all the history and geography, the Exodus story obviously means a lot to millions of people on a spiritual and symbolic level, right?
Absolutely. The Wikipedia entry talks about how important the Exodus and the Red Sea crossing are in Judaism, especially during Passover. There's this tradition that says every generation should feel like they personally left Egypt. It's a way of connecting to Jewish identity and faith.
It's not just a story from the past. It's something you experience in the present. And the Armstrong Institute article points out how the main events of the Exodus Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and Shavuot, which is also called Pentecost, they're all connected to these big spiritual ideas.
Yeah, the article explains that these holidays represent freedom from slavery, turning away from sin, and the agreement between God and Israel at Mount Sinai. So the Exodus story isn't just about a physical journey, it's about spiritual transformation and the core beliefs of Judaism.
It goes way deeper than just the events themselves. And the Discovered Media YouTube video talks about the Red Sea crossing as a miracle.
They really emphasize the idea that the parting of the sea was a supernatural event, something that science can't explain. From their point of view, it shows God's power and how he intervenes in human history to protect his people. They stress the importance of having faith even when things seem impossible, and they even encourage you to imagine what it would have been like to be there, to hear the wind, feel the dry seabed under your feet, and see those massive walls of water.
It's like you're saying the spiritual truth of the story is more important than finding physical proof.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways about the evidence for the Red Sea crossing?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that the evidence is really complicated, and there are different types of evidence to consider. We've looked at everything from people who believe the Bible literally and think the crossing happened at the Gulf of Aqaba, to people who try to explain it naturally using the Bitter Lakes, to scholars who analyze the geography and language and think it might have happened at the Suez Isthmus. And we've also talked about how hard it is to find solid archaeological proof for something that happened thousands of years ago in the ocean.
Exactly. Things decay, coral formations can be misleading, and there's still debate about whether the Exodus story is historically accurate. So finding definitive proof is really, really difficult.
But even though some people are still looking for that physical proof, there's no denying that the story has huge cultural, religious, and symbolic meaning for so many people. It's shaped identities, inspired faith, and given people hope for centuries.
That's the amazing thing about it, and I think that brings us to a final thought for our listeners to consider. Given all the different interpretations and all the challenges of historical research, what does the lasting power of this story tell us about our need to believe, the power of shared memories, and our desire to understand our past? It's a question that I hope you'll keep exploring, and I encourage you to be both critical and open-minded in your search for answers.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a fascinating journey.
The pleasure was all mine. It's been a great discussion.